Hey everybody, Chris Quarto here, and welcome again to another special episode of the Adult Autism, a Spectrum of Uniqueness podcast. I'm doing a series of podcast episodes entitled Autism Myth Courtroom, where in each episode we put one common autism myth on trial. We look at where the myth came from. Why do people believe it? What does the evidence say? And then we let the jury, you, decide. Okay, court is now in session. Today's case, why does it seem like everyone is autistic now? Or another way of saying this, autism is becoming so common that it must be getting overdiagnosed. Well, before we go any further with, I'd like you to think about your own answer to that question. I mean, when you hear someone say everybody is autistic nowadays, what goes through your mind? Maybe you agree with that, or maybe it just makes you feel angry, or you just disagree. Maybe you're just not quite sure what to think. Just keep your answer in mind because by the end of today's trial, we're going to go back to that. Okay. Now, if you're autistic, there's a good chance you've probably heard some version of this before. Maybe it was something like, well, back in my day, nobody had autism. Or it seems like autism is the new trend, you know? But if you're autistic, especially if you were diagnosed later in life, you may find yourself wondering, now, wait a minute. If I've been autistic my whole life, how could this possibly be a trend? All right, well, let's hear the case. First, the prosecution. The prosecution argues that autism diagnoses have increased dramatically over the past few decades. And they're right. Autism diagnoses have increased significantly. In adult autism diagnoses in particular have increased, especially among women, people of color, people who may have been overlooked in previous generations. Now, at first glance, that sounds maybe a little suspicious. If autism diagnoses are increasing, doesn't that mean autism itself is increasing? Or, maybe that professionals are handing out diagnoses too easily. That's another one. It's a reasonable question. But before we reach a verdict, let's look at the evidence. Exhibit A. What did people think autism looked like 40 years ago? Now, imagine someone asks you to picture an autistic person. What comes to mind? Well, for many people, especially older generations, the image is probably like a young boy, limited eye contact, obvious social awkwardness, difficulties, noticeable repetitive behaviors, maybe delayed language development. And you know what? That was the image a lot of professionals, including myself as well, many years ago. But here's the problem. Not all autistic people look like that. They never have, actually. The image was incomplete. And when your picture of autism is incomplete, a lot of autistic people will get missed. Let me ask you a question. How many people do you know who were diagnosed with autism, say, after they were 30 years old or maybe 40 years old? Well, 20 years ago, many of these same people probably wouldn't have been identified, not because they weren't autistic, but because nobody was looking for them. It was considered a childhood disorder. Okay, let's move on to Exhibit B, the people who fell through the cracks. Think back to elementary school, middle school. Remember that girl or boy who sat by themselves at lunch, or, you know, were kind of off by themselves doing their own thing on the playground? Or how about the teenager who copied what other people did just to fit in? Maybe that was you, okay? Or the person who spent decades wondering, why does everything seem harder for me than it does for everybody else? Many of these people weren't identified as autistic. Once again, not because they weren't autistic, but because nobody was looking for autism in people who looked like them. The autism was already there. The recognition wasn't. I mean, they may have been kind of perceived as quirky, but not autistic. All right, Exhibit C. Better flashlights. Imagine you're standing in a dark room and you turn on a flashlight and suddenly notice objects you couldn't see before. Now, did the flashlight create those objects? Well, of course not. They were already there. You just became able to see them once the light was shown on them. So the same thing has happened with autism. Researchers, therapists, educators have all helped us develop a much clearer understanding of how autism can present in people, especially in adults, in women, in people who learned to mask their differences. So we aren't necessarily discovering new autism. We're discovering people who were just overlooked in the past. Now, here's Exhibit D, the quote trend question. Let's address, I guess, what you would call, we'll call it the elephant in the courtroom. And some people argue that autism has become trendy. I mean, you see it on TikTok and all this kind of stuff. But let's think about that for a moment. When autistic adults tell their diagnosis stories, what do we usually hear? Do we hear stories about seeking a diagnosis because it was trendy, it was fashionable? Or do we hear stories about years of confusion and anxiety and burnout? Do we hear people wondering why relationships felt difficult? Or the one I hear a lot is why they've always felt different and just didn't know why. Well, I'll tell you this. Most people aren't pursuing an autism evaluation because it's trendy. They want answers. There's a difference. In fact, if you're a late diagnosed autistic adult that's listening to this right now or watching, just think about your own journey. I mean, did you pursue an evaluation because autism sounded like that's the thing to do? Boy, that sounds like me. I'm going to go do this. Or because you were trying to make sense of experiences that may have followed you for years. It's possible that the TikTok videos and all the information that's out there now, yeah, that could have motivated you, but the true reason is that you've always felt different and you wanted answers as to what's going on and why. That's a really important distinction. So here's a question for the jury. Let's try a little thought experiment here. Imagine that 50 years ago, many people had vision problems, but eye exams weren't all that common. It was probably even longer ago than that, probably about 70, 80 years ago. And then over time, eye care improves. Doctors become better trained, more people get screened, more people get glasses. Now, would we conclude that humans suddenly develop vision problems? Or would we conclude that we became better at identifying problems that were already there? Well, the same question applies to autism. So before the jury returns its verdict, I'd like you to cast your own vote. Based on what you've heard so far, which explanation seems more likely? That millions of people suddenly became autistic, or that we're finally getting better at recognizing autism in people who were previously overlooked? Think about your answer. And the verdict? The jury finds the myth misleading. The claim that everyone is autistic now suggests that, you know, autism suddenly appeared, or that mental health professionals are just kind of handing out diagnoses willy-nilly. But the evidence points to a different explanation. Our understanding of autism has evolved, and awareness has increased. That is true, especially over the past decade. And I'd argue that professionals have gotten better at recognizing autism in people who were overlooked in the past. There's a lot of continuing education going on right now in the mental health field for professionals. And so, once again, the autism itself isn't necessarily new. The recognition is. All right, time for closing arguments. Before we adjourn today's session, I'd like you to consider one final question. How many autistic people lived their entire lives before autism was really understood? How many of those people spent decades believing, oh man, that they were lazy, that they were defective, that they were too sensitive, or just failing at being human? We'll never know the exact number, but we do know this. Many autistic adults aren't discovering that they became autistic. They're finally discovering why they felt different all along. And that's a really different story. Perhaps the better question isn't, why does it seem like everyone is autistic now? Maybe the better question is, how many autistic people were overlooked for generations because we didn't yet know what autism could look like? The spectrum. Okay? All right, before we wrap up, I wanted to mention again that I currently have some additional evaluation appointments available in my private practice. And as a thank you to listeners of the podcast, I'm offering a special evaluation rate through July 15th, 2026. And if you've been considering a psychological evaluation to formally confirm an autism diagnosis and you want information about the process, just shoot me an email at chris@chrisquarto.com and mention the podcast. And I'd be happy to answer your questions. That email address again is chris@chrisquarto.com. I'll see you next time for another session of Autism Myth Courtroom. And don't forget, your uniqueness is awesome.